This very basic definition of ecology as the scientific study of the relationship between organisms and their environment can be investigated at different levels. The finest level at which ecologists examine relationships and ask questions is at the level of the individual. The next level is population, a group of individuals of the same species interacting in a particular time and place. Community ecology is going to introduce other species and how they interact with that population. Ecosystem ecology introduces abiotic elements. How do things like light availability and temperature interact with that community and the exchange of energy and nutrients between elements of that system? We're going to slide in another one, another level of ecology here between ecosystem and biome, which is landscape ecology. And then finally, the largest unit of study in ecology is the biosphere, looking at the entire biotic elements across the entire planet. Now, we're going to go through each of these levels of organization and talk a little bit more about what exact questions are examined at each level, and encourage you to follow along with your textbook to just see what topics are covered for each of these levels of organization in the text. We'll start with the finest unit of study in ecology, which is the individual. I encourage you to follow along with your text. This level of ecology is covered in part 2 in your textbook. So what are some of the questions that are examined at this level of ecology? One of the first ones is just defining what an individual is. Seems pretty straightforward for most species. You look out in a field and there's a bunch of deer in there and you can just count how many deer are there. But for some species, this can be actually quite challenging. For example, the image I have here of quaking aspen, for someone who's not familiar with this species, might say, oh, there's 100 or so individuals in that stand. But in reality, quaking aspen sprouts from the base, and that's probably all one genetic individual in that field. Individual ecologists will also examine what is the species. Again, pretty straightforward for most species, but can get complicated sometimes when you have species that look very similar to each other, very hard to distinguish, or even when you have hybrids and where there's kind of intermediate zones between defining one species from another. Individual ecologists will also examine questions related to what are the needs of that particular species. Big question at the individual level of ecology is what suite of environmental conditions determine whether or not a species is present and how abundant or healthy it is. We can separate out the multitude of variables that could influence this and examine the relationship between individuals and each of these variables one by one, which is what's illustrated in this graph here of bamboo and how temperature is influencing its rate of growth. So I'd like you to take a minute to look at this figure and try to figure out what is this species' range of tolerance for this variable. So the range of tolerance is looking at that minimum value and the maximum value at which bamboo can grow and just exist. But then we also can kind of tease that out a little bit further and say, okay, that's the range of which it can be alive. But what's the optimum range? Where is bamboo really going to thrive and do the best? So just take a minute to look at that in this diagram. Another big question at the individual level of ecology is adaptation. So you have this species, this individual that reflects a long-term evolution underneath that suite of environmental conditions. And as a result of that, it has specific morphological, physiological, or behavioral features that are a result of its DNA and a result of a long process of natural selection that has kind of weeded out features that do not reflect that environment and maintain features that do enable that species to be more successful under those environmental conditions. The next level of ecology is population ecology. A population is a group of individuals that belong to the same species and inhabit a particular location and a particular time. This level of ecology is covered in part 3 in your textbook. So if you want to look there and just kind of see what topics and concepts are covered in that section of the text. Mostly what population ecologists examine have a lot to do with numbers. How many individuals are there? How many are male? How many are female? How many are pre-reproductive and actively reproductive and post-reproductive? And it's mostly focused on predictions. How is this population going to change in the future? With what I have now, what does that mean is going to happen in 10 years, 20 years? How is this population going to change? The next level of ecology is the community. So this level integrates all the different species in that particular time and place, moving from the population, examining just one species and how they're interacting with each other. This is now integrating the multitude of species in that area. This topic is covered in part 4 and part 5 in the textbook. Let's start with this population of wildebeest in the Serengeti that we first looked at. And let's put a hat on of a community ecologist and think about how they would think about this differently. First, they would probably look at the plants that the wildebeest are eating. Plants are going to set the foundation of any terrestrial community and really actually define that community. We also might think about the competitors of that wildebeest that are eating that same vegetation. We would, of course, also have to consider the predators and the parasites to get a full picture of that community, of all the interacting species in that particular place and time. An ecosystem is going to take us up another level and include the abiotic elements of that system. This level of ecology is covered in part 6 in your textbook. And as you can see here, looking at that same system, right now what I have on the screen here just includes the community ecology. But as an ecosystem ecologist, we would look at how those abiotic elements are driving the transfer of energy and matter, these abiotic elements that are being exchanged in between. And I really want to emphasize that ecosystem ecologists focus on the transfer of energy and matter between these elements. Landscape ecology is going to literally expand our view geographically, not looking at just one particular type of system, but looking at the systems adjacent to it that interact with it. So it's a patchwork of interacting ecosystems in a defined area of land or water. At the biome level of ecology, we are again expanding our view geographically, looking across the planet and linking together ecosystems that share similarities in terms of dominant vegetation and abiotic factors like climate and similar geology. This is covered in part 7 in your textbook, specifically chapter 24. In different sources, you'll find different names of biomes and different categories and based on how they split and lump biomes together. In this course, we'll focus on 8. Tropical rainforest occurring here along the equator. The desert environments typically occurring about 30 degrees north and south of the equator. The savannas here in this band right here. The temperate deciduous forest, a biome quite familiar to us here in the northeastern U.S., Europe, and then the Asia-Russia complex over here. We'll also look at grassland environments that occur in the central areas of many continents. The chaparral, which might be one of the more, the least familiar ecosystems, that is also referred to as the Mediterranean oak shrubland. You can see it in these locations here along the Mediterranean. We also have a patch of that in California. There's some also in Australia as well. This is a shrubland system. We also have the boreal forest here in this light green. So these are the coniferous forests at the northern latitudes. Also hear them referred to as the taiga. And then finally, the tundra ecosystem, the treeless biomes of the most northern regions where you have permafrost, a lot of moss species, dwarf vegetation in those regions. The highest level of study in ecology is the biosphere. The biosphere represents the thin layer about the Earth that supports all life. both in the terrestrial and aquatic environment. And as illustrated in this diagram, I think it's quite interesting that the biosphere is unique out of the other 4 spheres, or the other 3 spheres, and that it does overlap with each of them. So there is life in the atmosphere, there's life in the hydrosphere, and there's life in the lithosphere as well. And that concludes the hierarchical levels of study in the field of ecology.